Could we build a city on the ocean? The idea sounds like science fiction. You picture giant domes, flying cars, and a world completely different from ours. But people are seriously thinking about it. Not just dreamers or writers, but engineers, architects, and even governments. The reasons are real. Land is getting crowded. Sea levels are rising. We might need new places to live. So, the question isn't just a fun thought experiment, it's becoming a practical problem to consider. The short answer is yes, we probably could. The technology is getting closer. But the long answer is much more complicated. It's a story about engineering, survival, money, and what it means to build a community from scratch. First, why would we even want to do this? The most pressing reason is climate change. Glaciers are melting. Oceans are expanding. Coastal cities around the world are facing a future with more frequent and severe flooding. Places like Miami, Jakarta, and Venice are already fighting a battle with the water. For some island nations, it's an existential threat. Their entire country could disappear beneath the waves. Building on the ocean could be a way to adapt, to rise with the tide instead of being swallowed by it. It's a defensive move. Then there's the space issue. Our planet has a lot of surface area, but most of it is water. About 70%. Meanwhile, the human population keeps growing. We're packed into cities that are sprawling outwards, eating up farmland and natural habitats. Building on the ocean could relieve some of that pressure. It opens up a vast new frontier for development without having to clear more forests or build unfertile soil. There's also an economic and political pull. The ocean is full of resources. There's energy in the waves, the tides, and the temperature differences in the water. There are minerals on the seafloor. There's food in the fish we farm. An ocean city could be a hub for these new industries. And for some, it's about freedom. Groups of people, often called seasteaders, dream of creating new societies in international waters. They want to experiment with new forms of government, free from the rules and taxes of existing nations. It's a modern version of heading out west to build a new life. So the motivation is there. It's a mix of desperation, necessity, and ambition. But how would you actually do it? You can't just pour concrete into the deep ocean. The engineering challenges are huge. There are a few main ideas people are exploring. The most straightforward approach is to build on what we already do. Think of an oil rig. These are massive structures that can withstand incredible storms in the middle of the sea. They are often semi-submersible platforms. This means a large part of the structure is underwater. The visible part, the platform where people work, sits on top of huge columns that go deep into the water. These columns are connected to big pontoons or hulls far below the surface, where the waves are less powerful. This design makes them very stable. A wave can crash against the columns, but the platform high above stays relatively still. We could scale this idea up. Instead of a single platform for drilling oil, you could connect multiple platforms together. You could build a small town on them. You could have housing, offices, parks, all sitting on these stable legs. The technology exists. We know how to build them. The problem is cost. Oil rigs are insanely expensive. Building a city of them would be astronomical, and you'd still feel a bit isolated on these separate platforms. Another idea is to create one massive floating structure. This is often called a very large floating structure, or VOLFs. Think of a giant flat barge, maybe a square mile in size. Japan has already experimented with this. They built a floating runway called the Mega Float in Tokyo Bay to test the concept. It was a kilometer long and worked well. A city built this way would feel more like land. You could have streets, buildings, and open spaces all on one continuous surface. The structure would be made of steel or concrete, a honeycomb of compartments that make it unsinkable, like a modern ship. It would be so large that normal waves would barely be noticeable. You wouldn't feel seasick. You'd just feel a very gentle, slow rocking motion during a big storm. But there are downsides. A structure that big would be a nightmare to build and assemble at sea. It would also be a massive wall in the ocean, affecting currents and marine life beneath it. And in a truly massive storm, like a Category 5 hurricane, the stresses on such a large, rigid structure would be immense. It could bend or break, so engineers are looking at more flexible designs or designs that are a collection of smaller floating modules that can be connected. This way the city could grow over time and it would be more resilient. One module could be damaged without sinking the whole city. There's a third, more futuristic idea. Instead of just floating on the surface, some designs go deeper. One concept is for a structure that is mostly submerged, with only the tops of buildings sticking out of the water. This would make it incredibly stable, almost immune to weather on the surface, but it's also a much more difficult and claustrophobic way to live. And of course, there's the simplest option built on shallow water. You can reclaim land like they did in the Netherlands or for the Palm Islands in Dubai. You build a wall and pump out the water, or you just dump tons and tons of sand to create new land. This isn't really a city on the ocean, but a city in the ocean. It's only possible in certain coastal areas, and it can be very destructive to the local marine environment. Another shallow water option is to build on stilts, driving massive pillars into the seabed. This is how many piers and coastal homes are built, but doing it for a whole city is another level of complexity. Let's assume we solve the engineering. We've built a massive floating platform, and it's stable. Now what? The real problems of city life begin. Where do you get power? You can't run a cable from the mainland hundreds of miles away. The city has to be self-sufficient. Fortunately, the ocean is a powerhouse. You could cover the city's roofs with solar panels. There are no trees or tall buildings to block the sun. You could erect wind turbines. The wind is usually stronger and more consistent at sea, but the most exciting power source comes from the ocean itself. There's wave energy. Devices can be designed that bob up and down with the waves, turning that motion into electricity. There's tidal energy, using the flow of water to spin turbines, like an underwater windmill. And then there's a concept called ocean thermal energy conversion, or OTEC. The deep ocean is very cold, while the surface is warmed by the sun. OTEC uses this temperature difference to run a heat engine. It's a stable, 24/7 power source. It's difficult to do, but for a city at sea, it could be the perfect solution. Okay, so we have power. What about fresh water? You're surrounded by water, but you can't drink any of it. The only answer is desalination. This means taking salt out of seawater. We have the technology to do this, mostly through a process called reverse osmosis. But it takes a huge amount of energy. So, a successful ocean city needs to produce a massive surplus of power just to have enough water to drink, bathe, and grow food. It's a fundamental challenge. The city's energy and water systems would be completely intertwined. Next up is food. You can't just go to the supermarket. Shipping everything from land would be expensive and unreliable. Again, the city needs to feed itself. Fishing seems obvious, but you can't rely on just catching wild fish. That's not sustainable for a whole city. The answer is aquaculture or fish farming. You could have large underwater pens attached to the city raising fish, shellfish, and seaweed. But you can't live on seafood alone. For fruits and vegetables, you'd have to turn to advanced farming techniques. You could have large greenhouses on the city's surface. More likely, you would use hydroponics or aeroponics. These are methods of growing plants without soil, using nutrient-rich water or mists. You could do this in vertical farms, stacking layers of plants inside buildings to save space. A floating city would likely have entire skyscrapers dedicated to growing food, with artificial lights powered by the city's ocean energy systems. It would be a completely closed-loop food system, and that brings us to the ugliest problem waste. What do you do with garbage and sewage? A city of thousands of people produces a lot of it. You absolutely cannot just dump it into the ocean. That would create a dead zone around the city and destroy the very environment you depend on. An ocean city would need the most advanced waste processing system in the world. Everything would have to be recycled, composted, or incinerated. Sewage would be treated, and the water reused, perhaps for farming. Organic waste could be turned into biofuel or fertilizer. The goal would be a zero-waste city, not just for environmental reasons, but for pure survival. When you're that isolated, you can't afford to throw anything away. Every piece of trash is a resource you failed to use. So, you've got a platform, power, water, food, and a way to handle waste. You have a functioning habitat. But a city is more than just infrastructure. It's about people. What would life actually be like? It would be different. For one, you'd be very aware of the weather. On land, we can ignore the weather most of the time. We stay inside. In an ocean city, a major storm isn't just an inconvenience, it's a direct threat to your home. The entire city might have to enter a lockdown mode. Maybe certain areas would be off limits. Maybe transparent storm barriers would rise up to protect open parks. People would have a much more immediate and respectful relationship with the power of nature. Transportation would also change. There would be no personal cars, there's no room and nowhere to go. Inside the city, people would walk, cycle, or use small electric vehicles like golf carts or trams. To get to and from the mainland, you'd rely on boats, ferries, and maybe aircraft. Some designs for these cities include runways for planes or landing pads for electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, eVTOLs, basically flying taxis. Drones would likely handle a lot of deliveries, both within the city and from nearby ships. The economy of the city would be unique. It couldn't be based on traditional manufacturing. It would be a hub for ocean-related industries, marine biology research, aquaculture technology, ocean energy development. It could also be a perfect location for data centers, using the cold, deep ocean water for cooling, which is a major expense on land. Tourism could be another driver, with people paying to experience life in a city on the sea. But then we get to the really hard questions. Who gets to live there? These cities will be incredibly expensive to build. The first ones will likely be funded by billionaires or large corporations. Does that mean they will only be for the rich? Will they become floating luxury resorts, gated communities for the global elite? That's a real risk. The dream of providing homes for climate refugees could easily be pushed aside by the reality of profit. You could end up with a two-tiered society, with wealthy residents living in penthouses while the workers who service the city are crammed into small, windowless cabins below deck. And who is in charge? If a city is built in international waters, what laws does it follow? Does it belong to the country that built it, or does it become its own independent nation, a microstate on the high seas? This is the seasteading dream. They imagine creating libertarian utopias with minimal government and regulation. But that vision has a dark side. An unregulated city in international waters could become a haven for tax evasion, money laundering, or other illegal activities. Without the oversight of a stable government, how do you ensure basic rights? Who runs the police? The courts? The hospitals? Do you pay for everything with a subscription service? If you can't afford your protection plan, are you just out of luck? Building a society from scratch is even harder than building the physical city itself. The legal framework for this is murky. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea governs activities in the ocean, but it was written with things like shipping, fishing, and mining in mind, not permanent sovereign cities. This legal gray area would be one of the biggest hurdles. There's also the psychological aspect. Could people handle living in such an isolated, confined environment? You can't just go for a drive in the country. You're always surrounded by water. For some, that might be beautiful and calming. It would need plenty of green spaces, parks, and areas for recreation to make it feel less like a machine and more like a home. This community would be everything. In such a remote place, you'd have to rely on your neighbors. Social cohesion wouldn't be a luxury. It would be a survival mechanism. And we have to circle back to the environment. Even with a zero-waste philosophy, a city is a huge physical presence. A massive floating platform would block sunlight from reaching the water below, which could affect the entire marine food web in that area. The construction and operation of the city would create noise pollution that could disturb marine mammals like whales and dolphins. There's always the risk of an accident, a fuel spill, or a chemical leak. Proponents argue that an ocean city could actually be an environmental positive. It could serve as a base for ocean cleanup operations, sending out fleets of ships to collect plastic. The structure itself could act as an artificial reef, providing a habitat for corals, fish, and other organisms. The city's research centers could be dedicated to studying and protecting the marine ecosystem. The idea is to become a steward of the ocean, not a parasite, but that requires a level of discipline and foresight that we humans don't always demonstrate. So, where does that leave us? Can we build a city on the ocean? The engineering is feasible. We can see a path forward, combining technologies we already use in new ways. We could build semi-submersible platforms, huge floating barges, or cities on stilts. We could power them with the sun, wind, and the ocean itself. We could grow food in vertical farms and recycle every drop of water. But the technical problems are in some ways the easy part. The real challenges are human. They are about money, law, and social organization. Who will pay for these cities? Who will govern them? And who will get to live in them? Will they be bastions of innovation and a refuge for those displaced by climate change? Or will they be exclusive playgrounds for the super rich, exacerbating the very inequalities they could be helping to solve? The first ocean habitats probably won't be full-blown cities, they'll be smaller. A research outpost, a luxury hotel, a specialized industrial platform. We will learn from these experiments. We'll figure out what works and what doesn't. It will be a slow, incremental process. The dream of a gleaming city on the waves is powerful. It speaks to our desire to explore, to innovate, and to survive. But we have to be careful not to get lost in the fantasy. Building a city on the ocean is not an escape from our problems on land. It's a reflection of them. If we can't figure out how to live sustainably and equitably on the vast continents we already have, what makes us think we'll get it right on a floating piece of steel in the middle of nowhere? The answer, then, is a cautious yes. Yes, we could build a city on the ocean. But the real question is not can we, but should we? And if we do, can we build one that is better, fairer, and more sustainable than the ones we leave behind on shore? That's a much harder problem to solve, and it has nothing to do with engineering. It has everything to do with us.